My name is Ashley Judd, and I am an advisor to the Leakey Foundation Board of Trustees. I am a passionate advocate for the conservation of the great apes and their habitats, and an ally to the indigenous peoples who share their environment with primates. I'm also a leader with multiple social justice movements, with a mission to create a more egalitarian and equitable society. Tonight's program is brought to you through a very special partnership between the Leakey Foundation and Orangutan Foundation International. I would like to thank you, our viewers, for your generous support of these organizations, this partnership, and our program. I am so pleased you have joined us, and it is my absolute honor to welcome you to an evening with Biruté Mary Galdikas. We are here to celebrate the journey of a pioneer, professor, and protector. Dr. Galdikas has achieved what many thought was impossible. She has studied orangutans longer than any other person in history, and it has been her life's work to bring orangutans and their plight to the attention of the world. She has worked tireless to save orangutans and their forests. As a frequent visitor to the tropical rainforests of the Congo to track and study bonobos, I understand a little bit the challenges of the forest environment and the perseverance and fortitude it takes to spend hours each day in the field. Amplify that by 50 years, and one might begin to understand the sheer magnitude of what Dr. Galdikas has accomplished. Biruté Mary Galdikas is a scientist whose groundbreaking work has shed light on previously opaque mysteries of primates. She is also a fierce defender of wildlife and the environment. And so it may be that one of Dr. Galdikas's greatest legacies will be proving that scientific research and conservation can and perhaps must be done in harmony to the benefit of each other. Ignited by Leakey Foundation support and sustained by the Orangutan Foundation International, Dr. Galdikas has led an extraordinary personal and professional life in the company of orangutans. Tonight, we are all so eager to learn more. Welcome to an evening with Biruté Mary Galdikas, and thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sharal Camisa Smith, the Executive Director of the Leakey Foundation and the host of tonight's conversation. I'd like to begin by thanking the incomparable Ashley Judd for tonight's welcome. She did a marvelous job setting the stage for tonight's program. I want to thank you, our guests, on behalf of the Orangutan Foundation International and the Leakey Foundation for joining us tonight and supporting both organizations. We're here to celebrate Dr. Galdikas' 50 years of orangutan field research and conservation, and to honor her as a pioneering scientist who has dedicated her life to understanding and teaching the world about orangutans. Before we start, if you're watching this program live, please introduce yourself using the chat feature on the right side of your screen. You can post comments or questions at any time, and Dr. Galdikas will answer as many questions as possible after our conversation. Tonight's program is scheduled to last 90 minutes, and I hope you can stay for the entire time. Thanks to the generosity of Leakey Foundation trustee Mark Jordan, Jennifer Gomersall, and the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, your registration donations have been doubled. However, if tonight's conversation so moves you, please use the form at the bottom of your screen to make an additional donation. Now it is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Biruté Mary Galdikas. Dr. Biruté Mary Galdikas was born after the end of World War II, while her parents were en route to Canada from their homeland of Lithuania. While growing up, she went to school in Toronto. She checked out her first library book, Curious George, at the age of 6 and by the second grade, she had decided on her life's work. She wanted to be an explorer. Dr. Galdikas is founder and president of Orangutan Foundation International. She is professor extraordinaire at the Universitas Nacional in Jakarta and full professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Her work forms the foundation of everything we know about orangutans. She has been featured on the cover of National Geographic. She's the author of scores of scientific articles and reviews and 4 books, including her autobiography, Reflections of Eden. Dr. Galdikas has traveled all over the world to educate people about orangutans and to share her research. Among many other achievements, she has received Indonesia's Hero for the Earth Award, the United Nations Global 500 Award, and the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. She established her groundbreaking study of orangutans in central Kalimantan, Borneo, 50 years ago in November 1971, with Dr. Louis Leakey as her mentor. It is now the longest running field study of any mammal by one principal investigator. She's inspired generations of researchers to follow in her footsteps. Dr. Galdikas was the first to document never before seen behaviors in orangutans. Tonight, she will give us a glimpse into her world. Welcome, Dr. Galdikas, and thank you for being here. Congratulations on this extraordinary milestone. How are you feeling tonight?
I'm feeling fine, especially now that I'm with the Leakey Foundation here.
Oh, that's so nice.
Salon.
Well, it's so nice to have you, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you. And, you know, my first question actually stems from an observation that I've had. I've noticed that on your website for Orangutan Foundation International, the word nature is capitalized, which implies your reverence for it. Can you tell us a little bit about when you first felt a profound connection to the natural world, and how did it shape your desire to study orangutans?
Well, my connection to the natural world actually began when I was a child. My mother, especially, would take me out to the forest. And when we lived in Toronto, we were very close to High Park. And High Park is, I believe, about a 400-acre piece of wilderness that is still very much intact. And my mother would take me there, and she would pick up leaves off the ground and show me that they could be used for medicinal teas. You know, we'd encounter small animals, we'd encounter ducks. And when I grew older, my parents would go north into northern Ontario. They didn't have a cottage, but we would spend time in their friends' cottages. So I always had a profound connection with nature from the time that I was a child. And part of it, I think, came from my Baltic heritage. My parents were Lithuanian, who had escaped to Lithuania after the Second World War. And if you look at Lithuanian culture and Lithuanian history, Lithuanians have always been connected to nature. An example is that they were the last nation in Europe to accept Christianity and give up their animistic religion, which is, of course, the worship of nature.
Wow. So you grew up in Toronto, and then you moved to Los Angeles, and you ended up attending school at UCLA. When you had the opportunity to meet Dr. Louis Leakey, what happened that fateful day? Can you tell us that story?
Well, it was very interesting. I was forced to attend a lecture by Louis Leakey because our normal class was canceled. And instead, the professor said, I was a graduate student at the time, said, you should go and see or attend Louis Leakey's lecture. And of course, I asked the fateful question, which students are always asking, and that was, will it be on the exam? The prof said, yes, it's going to be on the exam. So I went, otherwise I might not have gone. And as I listened to Louis Leakey, I gradually realized that maybe this was the person who held the key to the universe. Mm. And when he answered, you know, questions during the question and answer period after his lecture. He mentioned Diane Fossey. He mentioned that he had just received a telegram from her. You know, he patted his pocket. You know, he's a master show person, and mentioned that Digit, or one of the gorillas that she had habituated, was untying her shoelaces. And then I absolutely knew that this was the man who would help me meet my destiny. So I waited until everybody had more or less left. There were only a few people left in the auditorium. And I went up to him and I asked him, I said, will you help me study orangutans? And he looked a tinge startled. And then our eyes met and we recognized each other. I knew who he was and he knew who I was. And he said, I'm leaving Los Angeles tomorrow. Write me a letter. And I said, well, what's the address? And he said, it's just Louis Leakey, Olduvai Gorge, Africa. He said, let him get to me. So I said, thank you. But then when I got home, my mother was very excited. She said somebody had called on behalf of Louis Leakey. It was Joan Travis, who was a trustee of the founding trustee of the Leakey Foundation. And I was supposed to meet Louis Leakey the next day in Westwood, which is in West Los Angeles. And again, I knew that I was going to go to Southeast Asia to study orangutans. But what I didn't realize was that I would have to wait 3 years before it finally happened, before Louis Leakey found the money, you know, helped start the permission process, so on and so forth.
Well, I must ask, you said that that moment was somewhat spontaneous. And where did you summon that courage as a young student to walk up and ask one of the most famous scientists in the world for this opportunity?
I just knew. When he mentioned Diane Fossey, and sometime in that lecture, he might have mentioned Jane Goodall, but I knew. Like I said, I knew this was the person who would unlock the universe for me. And I would have studied orangutans, even if I had not met Louis Leakey, but he enabled me to study them much sooner than I would have had I had to do it alone. So I'm very grateful, very, very grateful.
Well, you said that you waited 3 years, and I am curious to know what you did for those 3 years. But once you set out for Indonesia, and you eventually started what would become the longest continuous study of any wild orangutan population in the history of science, I'm curious, did you understand the magnitude of what you were attempting to do?
I understood. And part of it was because I had models to follow. And models are very important for people. So I knew that there was a woman living with the chimpanzees who had been studying them for years. I also knew that Diane Fossey was studying gorillas. Louis Leakey had introduced her to me during that lecture that I attended. So I knew. In fact, I made a bet with one of my fellow graduate students that I would never permanently return to North America once I started orangutans. And I think we bet a case of wine. Never collected, but I've stayed in Borneo, and I've stayed in Borneo for 50 years now. Off and on, obviously. I don't stay there 100%, but off and on, I have lived there now for 50 years. And again, I'm very grateful to Indonesia. I'm very grateful that they have accepted me and allowed me to what I do, allowed me to do what I do, allowed me to work with orangutans, protect them, and help them.
How did you prepare to go? What did you do during those 3 years that helped you get ready? Having never been to Indonesia before, what did you do to get ready mentally and physically?
Well, it was very interesting. Louis Leakey asked me if I would get my appendix taken out. before I went to Southeast Asia. And he told me later that Diane Foster had gotten her appendix out as preparation for her work in Africa. Well, I never got my appendix out, but I told him I had my tonsils out. Or, no, I hadn't had my tonsils out, and that I would get my tonsils out if he wanted me to. But I never did that either. So, and what I did for preparation, mainly I walked, I hiked, I read, I tried to find out everything I could about orangutans, which was very, very minimal at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing, very little was known. And when I say very little was known, scientists didn't even know if orangutans were social. They didn't know whether they were frugivores, whether they were fruit eaters, or leaf eaters, or what have you. They knew virtually nothing about them. They didn't even know whether they were arboreal or terrestrial. In other words, lived up in the canopy or were found mainly on the ground. So,
Unbelievable. Well, right now we have an amazing clip showing the early days at Camp Leakey, which you named after your mentor, Lewis. And I would love for you to narrate this video, if you could tell us what we're watching.
well, it seems like we're watching me 45 to 48 years ago, hacking my way through the Borneo rainforest. And I'm in the swamp, and the trail is overgrown, or there's no trail at all, but it looks like the trail is overgrown. So I'm going through pools of dark, acidic water. It's a peat swamp forest, so the water is very high in acid, so high that it has the same pH as, in some places, as table vinegar. And above me is a wild-born ex-captive gibbon that we have rehabilitated, or that we are in the process of rehabilitating to life in the wild. And she often followed me out when I went into the forest. And I invite her to jump in my arms, and she does. And here I'm on the Sequoia Cannon River with two wild-born ex-captive orangutans. Because shortly after I arrived in Borneo, I started rehabilitating wild-born orangutan infants, which the Indonesian forestry would confiscate. And until I started my work, they had no place to put these little infants, so they didn't confiscate them, even though it was against the law to have orangutans as pets. And over the years, we have rehabilitated well over 800 wild ex-captive orangutans back to the wild. And most of them have survived. You know, some of them leave, and then they come back 5 years later, and they're doing well. I'm not saying all of them survive, but most of them survive. And this is very important. This is my following a wild adult male on the ground. And it was very difficult initially to habituate wild orangutans. And part of the difficulty is they're solitary or semi-solitary. So you have to habituate them basically one at a time. It's not like chimpanzees or bonobos or gorillas or virtually any other primate, higher primate. You know, you can habituate groups of them at a time, but I never had that privilege. I had to habituate them one at a time. And sometimes it took me 15 years to habituate a female, an adult female.
My goodness.
Yeah.
That's remarkable footage, and I'm just so pleased that we can share that this evening. Also, because most of us have never walked in a tropical rainforest like the kinds in Borneo, and it looks like nothing here in the United States, completely foreign. And I'm wondering if there is one piece of advice or one thing that you wish you could have told your younger self as she arrived in Indonesia.
Yes, and actually it's a very simple thing, and it's a piece of advice that I give students, before they go into the field, and that is, at twilight, turn on your flashlight. Because we had so little money, my former husband, Judd, who had gone with me to Borneo, that we shared one flashlight between the two of us, and we didn't turn on our flashlight until it was totally dark. So I had encounters with cobras at twilight. I had encounters with bears, Malayan sun bears at twilight, because I didn't let them know I was coming because I didn't turn on my flashlight. In Africa, the big carnivores, the big predators, they don't start roaming at night. Most of them are crepuscular, which means they're active at dawn and twilight. They start roaming just as twilight begins. And there are people who have been killed by big predators like lions who were killed at twilight. And that's when you encounter them. They're hungry, they've been sleeping all day, and now they're out looking for food. You've got to let them know you're coming, because if they don't know you're coming, they may attack you. They may mistake you for food. So
Incredible. This sounds kind of terrifying. It sounds exciting. It sounds like it could be quite emotional, being out there mostly alone. How did you deal with early life in the camp? And what was it like when you woke up in the morning until you went to bed at night?
Well, one of the things I did when I followed wild orangutans, or when I went to the nest, and it was, pitch black, the overhead canopy sort of blocked out the sky, blanked out the sky. And what I would do is I would sing, just to let animals know that I was coming. I would sing. I would make up little songs and sing. I mean, I'm not the best singer in the world. I'm not particularly melodic, but I would sing just to let animals know that I was coming, that I was not a threat. And that's one of the things that I did. And then also in the early days, I had wild-born ex-captive infants that I was taking care of, rehabilitating. And sometimes I was forced to take them with me. I remember my first infant, it was Sudito and Sudiarso. Sometimes I would take two of them, because when I left in the morning, they would see that I was leaving. And of course, orangutan infants need to cling to their mothers because their mothers are moving. Their mothers don't have permanent home bases. So, in the morning, there'd be a lot of squealing. And most of the time, I would leave my hut and I would have at least one infant on me. And this continued for a few years. But it was benefit, because what happened is the female orangutans I was following habituated to me much quicker than they did to my former husband, Rod Brindamore. Rod would go follow a female, and he'd say that she'd kiss, squeak, drop branches, hoot and holler. But I went to follow that same female the next day, Sudito or Sudiarso latched onto my side, just like they would have been latched onto their mothers. And the orangutan female would gaze down at me and pay no attention. Well, she recognized me as a fellow mother. No threat.
Remarkable. Well, you mentioned female orangutans, and I understand that after almost 2 months of very hard work, you successfully followed a wild orangutan named Beth and her infant Bert for 5 days straight. How did that first experience impact you?
Oh, it was wonderful. It indicated that orangutans could be followed. It indicated that orangutans could be habituated. So we found Beth on December 24th. She made a nest in the canopy, and then we went back to camp, and the next morning got up way before dawn, walked in the dark, got to her nest, and I was with my then husband, Rod Brindamore, and we sat under the nest waiting. And as dawn rose, as the sun rose, she left her nest. And I was so delighted, almost delirious with delight. And I started writing in my notebook. And it was only then that I realized it was December 25th, 1971. And it was the best Christmas present I have ever received. But she was still there at the nest.
How special. Wow, what a gift.
What a gift, yes.
Well, you are famously known as one of the Trimates, a trio of researchers that include yourself, Jane Goodall, and Diane Fossey. Your mother, Philomena, and Leakey Foundation founder, Joan Travis, both played critical roles in your life, both personally and professionally. And I'm wondering how these four relationships influenced you personally and professionally.
I think it's really important for people, especially women, but men also, to have mentors. And people who have mentors, whether in business or academia or what have you, do much better in life. And Joan Travis was one of my mentors, and of course my mother was an extreme mentor. And it's interesting because both Joan and my mother, Philomena, became very good friends, and they cooperated. And an example is that a few years later, I had a forestry delegation from the Indonesian government visit. So I called my mother and said, "You have to invite this group to dinner, to your house, to have something." Well, my mother then teamed up with Joan Travis, and she and Joan Travis arranged for the group, there were 10 forestry officers from the Indonesian government, to have dinner and sort of a welcome ceremony at Joan's house in Westwood. And my mother and Joan later told me about that event. And at the end, they were all singing songs. They didn't do karaoke. They were just singing songs, and they had a delightful time. They were laughing. And the interesting thing is that a number of years later, a new minister, forestry minister, came into government. He was an old in the sense that he'd been in the forestry department for a while. And he was kind of a surprise because he was an actual forester. He was not a politician. And he was appointed Minister of Forestry. So, of course, I went to see him. And I'd been in Indonesia maybe 20 years by then. Maybe not quite. But I went to see him. And I said to him, when I entered his office, I said, I'm Biruté Mary Galdikas, and I have been studying orangutans in Kalimantan Tengah for the last few years. And he looked at me and he said, "I know exactly who you are. I've met your parents in Los Angeles. I've been entertained by your parents." And I was like in shock. And then I talked to him further, and then I realized that he was the junior member of that team of 10 foresters so many years ago who had been entertained by my parents and Joan Travis and her husband, Arnold. And he was a last-minute addition to that group. There were 10 foresters. One of them dropped out. So, a few days earlier, before the whole group left, he was the minister. The man who is now minister was substituted. And so he ended up going to Los Angeles. And so he knew who I was, and he was very supportive. Well, he'd met my parents, right?
Well, our beloved Joan Travis made so many things happen. And it sounds like your parents made a lot of things happen for you as well. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how they supported you as a young woman pursuing a career in science.
Well, my parents, as immigrants, placed a very deep emphasis, very heavy emphasis on education. While I was growing up in Canada, in Toronto, my mother would say to me, "Don't do any housework, do your homework." And she wouldn't let me wash dishes, she wouldn't let me clean. She said, "Do your homework." And she also said, "We are immigrants to Canada, and we do not have any connections. So, if you want to succeed in life, you have to have an education." So when I was very young, I think I was about 12 years old, I found out that the highest degree that you could get was a PhD. And I didn't even know what a PhD was, but I resolved that I would get a PhD. And that I did. And again, it was because this very strong immigrant, which my parents were, emphasis on education.
That's wonderful. I'm sure most of our viewers would love to hear some stories about your relationship with Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey. Are there any that you would like to share with us tonight?
Yes, I would. I've always regarded both Jane and Diane as my inspiration and my models. And when Louis Leakey died, I had been in the field maybe 1 year. And Jane Goodall, bless her heart, was getting a grant or a donation from somebody in the Leakey Foundation. And Jane said, don't give it to me, give it to Birute. She's been in the field, very short time, and she needs the money more than I do. And she actually did it twice. And this was in the early days. So I've always felt that my relationship, and I hope she reciprocates, and I think maybe she does, has been less one of friendship, but more of sisterhood. And the thing is that, your relationship with your sister is forever. And the same with Diane. I just recently found a note that Diane had written to me. I think it was in 1981. And I'd lost the note. I remembered I had it, but I'd lost it. And we just found it in our Wi-Fi office the other day. And it was such a beautiful note that, I'm going to do something if I don't know quite yet. Certainly, put it up in our office. And Diane was always very supportive. Diane was a person who had, how would I say it? She had a temper. She could be temperamental. But it was like, once the volcano blows, then it's over. It's bringing us back to normal. So Diane was always very, very supportive. And I really appreciated her support as well as Jane's. So they've been very supportive, very supportive.
Did you ever visit their research sites, and did they ever come to see you?
Yes, I visited Gombe, which was then Gombe Stream Reserve, before I went to Borneo, and Jane was there, and Jane was very hospitable. And I actually had the privilege of following Passion and Palm. And I followed them up the mountain, up the hill. And later, Passion and Palm became notorious because they started an epidemic of infanticide. Passion and Palm together killed many of the infants that were born during those years, immediately after I had visited Gombe. And Jane explained it that Passion basically did the equivalent of child abuse, that she didn't treat Palm in the same way that other chimpanzee mothers had treated their infants. So Passion wouldn't let Palm ride on her. Palm had to follow her at a very young age. And I also saw this, but I didn't understand it because I wasn't a primatologist and I had no experience with chimpanzees. But I remember when I was following Passion and Palm up that hillside, that there was a lot of squealing going on. That Palm really had a hard time keeping up to Passion. She was this very small juvenile, possibly even a large infant, and she was struggling. She would squeal, but her mother never stopped. Mother never turned around. And it was basically a form of child abuse, in some boundary sense. And so, as far as I know, Jane was not overly surprised that, this is the phenomena that occurred once Palm got a little bit bigger, grew up. And the infanticide stopped when Palm did as chimpanzee females do, is during adolescence, during once it started getting the big swellings, she left the group, the community, for a neighboring group, and then Pesh was left alone. And then she could no longer, overcome mother chimpanzees. And what Jane said was that the only infants that survived during that whole episode of terror were infants whose mothers, made a fuss, and a male showed up, or a male was there, an adult male, and he defended the mother and her infant against passion and palm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I
was just going to say that, this is something that doesn't quite happen with orangutans. Because orangutans are semi-solitary or solitary. The males are by themselves, the females are by themselves. So this kind of, we can call it a social interaction. It simply doesn't happen.
Well, I do actually want to transition and talk about your own research. But before I do, I'm curious to know if you and your fellow trimates corresponded, if you shared notes, if you, how you supported each other. Because at the time, you were the three. And I can imagine the weight that might feel like, the excitement. Maybe they were your cheerleaders, your support unit. How did that impact your research? Did you share notes? Were you in communication about what you were seeing and what they were seeing?
Well, Jane and Diane worked in Africa. And Africa is a totally different continent, a totally different milieu, totally different culture, totally different nations than the milieu in Southeast Asia. So before I went to Borneo, Kalimantan, I spent some time at Gombe where I got training, how to take notes, how to follow. And again, it was due to the hospitality of Jane. I was able to visit the Runga volcanoes where Diane had worked a number of years after Diane was gone, and I did, see gorillas, encounter mountain gorillas. I even interacted a little bit with mountain gorillas. But the main support was very moral. I mean, it was moral support, it was encouragement. Sometimes I would meet with Jane and, I'd ask for her advice about certain issues. And she would always give very cogent, very strong, very astute advice about things. And Diane, of course, was killed in, I think it was 1985, if I'm not mistaken. My memory isn't quite as good as it used to be. I think it was 1985. And so I didn't get very many opportunities to meet her. And where I usually met her, ironically, was London and also the United States. So I never met Diane in the field in Africa. But I had a chance to talk to her. So, it was more informal. And occasionally we'd write letters to each other. And again, it was a separation of geography and species.
Well, the three of you have become icons and heroes and inspiration to so many people. And you recently told me a fun story that you received a letter once from a young girl who had dressed up like you for Halloween. And I just think that's wonderful. But I'm wondering what it feels like to be a cultural icon, also a scientific icon.
Well, I've never quite thought of myself in those terms, but I think it's very important that people have models, people have inspirations, and that people look up to other people who are worthy of being looked up to. So I feel very privileged, I feel very honored that this occasion has happened to me. And I hope I continue to do the best I can to do everything possible for orangutans, the other great apes, wildlife, and the tropical rainforests of the world. So all we can do is continue doing what we're doing and hope that what we're doing, lives up to snuff. So I do feel honored that anybody would even think of me in those terms. But certainly, I have always thought of Jane and Diane with the greatest admiration and respect, because I do understand through my own experience what it takes to do, and I hope I'm not being arrogant in this, to do what they did. And what they did was actually quite incredible. I mean, I have met people. I had a student who went to Senegal, and he spent 2 months trying to habituate chimpanzees. He was working with a French researcher. And he said during the 2 months, he saw wild chimpanzees once, very briefly. And when you think of what Jane Goodall did, and what Diane Foster did in terms of habituating their African apes, it's actually quite remarkable. Because there's lots of people who have gone to Africa and have tried to habituate chimpanzees and gorillas and found it extremely difficult.
And what you did is remarkable. And I'm so thrilled that we can be here tonight to talk about some of it, including your own research. The Leakey Foundation is proud to have supported your career with 19 research grants. Can you tell us a few important discoveries about orangutans that you made? I know there are many, but maybe some that you were most surprised about or you're most proud of.
Well, my goal has been to document orangutan life histories. And once you have whole life histories, then you can start testing hypotheses about those life histories and what causes those life histories. So some of my discoveries have been the birth interval. I documented the fact that in Tanjung Puting, where I work, the average birth interval for any female is about 8 years. So a female does not give birth after she's given birth once for more than 8 years. And the other thing that I documented is the fact that orangutan females do not give birth until they're 15 to 17 years of age. And if you think about it, what that means is that probably an orangutan female in the wild only gives birth about 4 times in her entire reproductive career. That makes orangutans in the wild extremely susceptible, extremely vulnerable to extinction. So it's not surprising that orangutans, all species, are on the edge of extinction. Because if you kill females, it's going to take 15 to 17 years for the new batch of infants to develop until they, give birth. And then the other thing that we have discovered, and this is with the help of one of my students who was doing genetic studies, I always realized that when I looked at the females in our study area, they all looked alike. They kind of looked like clones of each other. And I also noticed that when the wild-born ex-captive infants came in, the confiscated infants, that they looked somewhat different, even though they were from the local area. So I came to the conclusion that the wild orangutan females in our study area must be very closely related. And it wasn't until a few years ago that we started doing these genetic studies. And I'd been collecting, feces for ages, that we discovered that, yes, they were extremely closely related. They were basically either first cousins, almost first cousins, or aunts, nieces, so closely related that, basically they were extended families, almost nuclear families, not quite. And we also discovered something that we had figured out, is that the males came and went. There are females who have basically stayed in the study area for almost the entire 50 years that I have been studying wild orangutans in Tanjung Priok National Park. But there isn't one single male that has stayed. The males come and go. And so what we find when we do the genetics is that the males are not quite as closely related to each other or to the females as the females are to each other. So what you have are populations of females. And then you have males that come and go, and the males travel further. So the genetic diversity, again, I'm not a geneticist, so forgive me if I get it wrong, but the genetic diversity is actually carried on by the males, by these nomadic males who will only stay in an area once they are dominant. And once they lose that dominance, they leave, they disappear, they go someplace else, and they become much more nomadic. So again, these are some of the things that we documented and we demonstrated. I mean, there are all kinds of other things. We documented the fact that orangutans spend 60% of their time on average eating fruit. We also documented the fact that sometimes the fruits don't come into season. You know, there's horrible droughts. Sometimes the rains won't stop. And then the animals turn to, the orangutans turn to bark. And then you have crises of starvation, crises of famine if the fruit season doesn't come, within time. So, there are many things that we discovered. And the other thing that I was very fortunate to see is adult male orangutans fighting. They combat. They're like tanks. And sometimes these combats last for hours, but these combats only occur if there is a receptive female or a proceptive female in the vicinity. And, she's like a golden fruit. When a female becomes receptive, and I'm talking about adult females, not adolescents, it's like the males gather. Now, there's solitary or semi-solitary species, they don't get dozens of them, they'll get several of them. And the adult males do come back, and the adult males also chase off the sub-adult males. And sometimes what happens is an adult male is busy chasing another sub-adult male, and then a second sub-adult male sneaks in and physically copulates with the female. In other words, he rapes her. And that's the other thing that we discovered. Other people had documented some of this, but we discovered how extensive rape was. But sub-adult males were basically rapists. And what about adolescent females? Well, adolescent females preferred the adult male. So I saw instances, and it was sometimes quite amusing, where a sub-adult female, an adolescent female, one who was maybe not yet 15, not yet 17, would diddly-bop up to an adult male and try to seduce him. I mean, sometimes in the most pornographic ways. And he would, continue eating, slap her away. And then she would race out of the tree, and she'd sit there, squealing in frustration that she wasn't able to seduce him. But if it was an adult female, then he was always interested, but not an adolescent female. And so I explained this sort of dislike or whatever you want, a rejection of adolescent females because of adolescent sterility. If it's a 13-year-old female, then 14-year-old females, she may look seductive, she may be very seductive, she may be attractive, but she probably will not give birth for a year or two. So the adult male is not interested. Why waste his time? Now, I'm not saying that he thinks that way, but he looks at her and he doesn't find her attractive. And those males who did find adolescent females attractive basically wasted their time and were outcompeted reproductively by adult males who only were interested in adult females. And what I documented is that it was like the older the female, the more the adult males liked her. Kind of the reverse of what you have in human terms. And also, that males could be fooled. I only once in 50 years have seen an adult male, a wild adult male orangutan, grooming a female. Just doesn't happen. I mean, they do other things, but they don't groom. And who was it that this adult male was grooming? Well, he was grooming a wild-born, ex-captive female who had an adopted infant. It wasn't her infant. She had adopted it from one of the orphans that came into camp. And then she had a juvenile that she had adopted when he was an infant, when he was following her. So I couldn't believe it. You know, I timed it. That wild adult male groomed that female for 9 minutes. He was fooled. He was deceived. I mean, he was looking at her, and you and I might see a little cranky adolescent female. You know, she wasn't the largest of adolescent females, but what he saw was a maximum producer. You know, this young female had 2 offspring that were following her, one of which she was carrying, one was following, one was carrying. I mean, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe his luck. So he groomed her in order to make sure that she didn't run away. So those are the kinds of things that I've been documenting all these years. I've also documented 2 female adolescents following each other. And I knew, because I knew who their mothers were, that they were not sisters. I've also seen 2 female orangutans mating, adolescent females. And I've seen 2 sub-adult males mating. I've never seen adults. You know, the bonobos do have, you know, female-female interactions, female-female copulations, and male-male copulations as adults, but I've never seen orangutans as adults do it. But I have seen adolescent females do it. In fact, I couldn't believe it. You know, they're just sort of doing a regular copulation. I look up and I thought, did I mistake one of them? Was one of them actually a male? But I checked and checked, and it wasn't. There were 2 female adolescents. So there are all kinds of little things that one discovers if one watches patiently and follows them day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out. And that's what we're doing. So we're accumulating data, and it's very hard because we can only follow, usually, 1 adult male or 1 adult female and her infant at a time.
Well, before we move on to your conservation work, I have 2 more questions about your research. One is maybe a bit quicker than the other. How do you name your orangutans? And is there a protocol for that? And secondly, we understand why Louis Leakey thought that you should study the orangutans in relationship to human origins. But why do you think orangutans are an important species to study to better understand our own origins? So 2 questions.
Well, the first one, how do we name our orangutans? Well, initially what we decided to do was name the wild ones using Anglo names, English language names, and the wild-born ex-captives that came to us confiscated by the forestry department and the police with Indonesian names. But we didn't quite keep to that protocol entirely. But what happened is we started naming the wild-born ex-captives, the ones we were rehabilitating. We had hundreds of them, with the names of people who were important to us, both Indonesian and non-Indonesian donors, people who helped us, people who were supportive, friends, some of whom visited. So we started having a wide variety of names for the wild-born ex-captives. For the wild ones, what we do is, you know, if it's Maud, and we follow Jane's procedure, protocol, and that is that all her descendants, known descendants, are named with the same first letter. You know, so Maud, it was, you know, Morton. Mel, I mean.
Beth and Bert.
Yeah, Beth and Bert, exactly.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Keep the lines separate, the matrilines, because we really don't know what's happening with the, you know, the male lines. And the second question is, why are orangutans important in the study of human evolution? Well, it's very interesting. And I say that a lot because so much is interesting. And that is that chimpanzees are our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom, as are bonobos, which again is an interesting parallel case. It tells you that genetics does not necessarily indicate social behavior, because bonobos and robust chimpanzees, or so-called common chimpanzees, except there's nothing common about them, are quite different in terms of their sociality. And then, of course, gorillas are also very closely related to us. Well, orangutans are not that closely related to us compared to chimpanzees and gorillas. But orangutans are important for a different reason, and that is that even though our ancestors, separated from the ancestors of orangutans maybe 12 to 14 million years ago, and the ancestors of chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans separated maybe 7 million years ago, possibly even 6, but usually the number that I read is 7. Orangutans are more closely related to our own human ancestors than we are, because orangutans have been genetically so stable over the millennia that they are closer genetically to our own ancestors than we ourselves are, because our evolution, whatever it was, genetic, behavioral, ecological, occurred so quickly that we have changed rapidly and extensively from our own ancestors. So when we look at orangutans, what do we see? We're actually looking back at our past. They're not our ancestors, but they're almost ancestors. And if you want to look at a sort of a story, image, or look at stories that are common in our culture, religious beliefs, faith beliefs, we're looking at a creature who basically never left the Garden of Eden. That's who orangutans are. They are what we were 12 to 14 million years ago. Now, they're different, but they're much more like that than we are. So they give us a glimpse into the past. And what they indicate is the incredible diversity of social and ecological situations that our great ape and hominid ancestors went through. So if we look at the end of the Miocene, we find that there's lots of creatures that we would now call great apes. Most of them went extinct, and one did not go extinct, and that was humans, the ancestors of humans. And if you look at who the ancestors of humans were like, they were not the typical great ape. They were actually very different. And that is actually something that I'm very interested in, because basically, after you study orangutans, you come to the conclusion that in many ways, what we humans did is we became monkeys. If you look at our evolutionary history and see it all, we're basically monkeys. We have so many similarities with monkeys, and we emerged at about the same time. So, I'm saying it in a non-scientific way, but you look at what happened, and 7 or 8 million years ago, at the end of the Miocene, about that age, the forests began retreating. The grasslands emerged. And who emerged on those grasslands? Monkeys. And who retreated? Apes. There we are.
Thank you for that answer. Both answers, actually. And I want to make sure we have time to talk about your conservation work, because it is so integral to who you are as a person. And in the 1980s, when it became clear that orangutans and their forests were in trouble, how did your work change as the threats to orangutans intensified?
Well, the threats to orangutans were always there from the very beginning. in the first week that I walked into Pangolambun, I arrived in Borneo, it was very clear that many people were keeping orangutans as pets. The orangutan killing was going on. But what happened in the 1980s is that even though in the 1970s there was a lot of illegal logging was carried out by small groups of local men. In the 1980s, the threat, as you indicated, intensified. And what happened is that palm oil came into the picture. And because of palm oil, vast areas of forest were denuded, cut down, burned, so that palm oil plantations could be established. And we began, it was very difficult, but we began to start patrolling. We invited the police to come into the national park, into the areas around the national park. We patrolled with the police, but of course, and this went on for years. And it wasn't until relatively recently that the Indonesian government really put a strong stop to illegal logging. We weren't able to do it totally, but unfortunately the palm oil continued, and the deforestation continued because of palm oil. And the problem is that palm oil is an extremely profitable cash crop. And huge corporations arose, multinational corporations, local corporations, that take advantage of the cash crop. And so my hope is that as we sit here speaking about the forest, that the conference COP recently has just issued a statement that I think President Biden and President Jokowi have put together, and that is to stop deforestation in Indonesia. So I hope it happens. And they're putting the details now on how this accord will be implemented. And I heard, now this is all secondhand, I've talked to people who have been following this very closely, that apparently the United States is going to give, or somebody is going to give, $5 billion to stop deforestation in Indonesia. I hope this is correct. So maybe, just maybe, I hope and pray that we do see something coming out of this talk.
Can you talk to us about how the habitat loss and destruction of the forest impacts the orangutans directly?
Well, what it does is that genetically we know what it does. The males can't go anyplace, and so what you get is, and the reason they can't go anyplace is because they have to come down to the ground because the fragments of forest are getting smaller and smaller, and orangutans are fruit eaters, and they need large areas to access the fruit that they need. But if the fruit trees are gone, or if there are only a few of them, they literally starve to death. I remember even years ago hearing of cases in Malaysia and Borneo, where orangutans were coming to village garbage dumps, scavenging for food. So the whole question becomes, orangutans don't have enough to eat, and they die. That's the direct consequence of forest fragmentation and forest loss.
Well, all of us on this call, on this gathering tonight, need to know how you remain hopeful. And I think we also need to know how each of us can be part of a positive solution.
Well, sometimes it's hard to remain hopeful, but as long as there's some forest, as long as wild orangutan populations continue to exist, there's hope. And how we can be part of the solution is actually relatively, it's kind of a paradox because it's actually very hard. At the same time, it's actually easy. And so the first thing that people can do is recycle paper. I mean, simple, because paper is actually recycled. And we don't want those tropical rainforests that are so precious to be cut down just for paper. The second thing that we can do as individuals is plant native trees. whether it's in our front yards, in our backyards, just plant native trees. Now, let's make sure they're native, because there's some trees, you plant them, like you might plant eucalyptus in some place, and they look, and I'm not saying it's just eucalyptus, but often it's eucalyptus. It's so thirsty that what it does is the roots lower the water table, and so other trees can't compete. So plant native trees. No matter where you are, plant native trees. And the third thing is to eat less or no palm oil. There's palm oil that is now destroying the forests of Borneo, and it's palm oil that is now invading, once again, Africa. Nigeria used to be the fourth largest palm oil producer in the 1960s. Well, then they discovered oil, but now they're, discovering palm oil again. And it's also invading the Amazon. So, try to use less palm oil, or, as I do, avoid it entirely. And also, I would say, use less meat. Be as vegetarian or as vegan as you can, but avoid processed food. So there are many steps that people can take as individuals, but what is more difficult is to convince politicians, corporations, and governments that we have to change the systems that operate today in a very systematic way. And the individual can't do that alone. The individual has to do it with the help of others. And I hope this is what's going to happen, because if that doesn't happen, unless every single person on this planet plants a tree, which would mean like 8 billion trees planted or whatever our human population is, it's not going to happen. So that's my advice. I mean, they're very simple things that we can do.
Yes. Well, thank you for those ideas and for your insights and for the amazing stories that you shared with us about your incredible journey these past 50 years. It's been a wonderful conversation. We're now going to, actually in a bit, we're going to take questions from the audience. And so if you're watching this program live and have a question, now is the time to submit it in the chat. Before we get to questions, though, we have a special giveaway. Everyone who has registered for this live program tonight has been entered into this giveaway. We are going to give away a poster from the Leakey Foundation Symposium in 1981 titled Man and Ape, featuring Dr. Galdikas, Jane, and Diane. We will also be gifting a signed copy of the famous National Geographic magazine, and also a signed paperback copy of her memoir, Reflections of Eden. So now I have the pleasure of announcing the winners for each of these items. And if you're watching live right now, we would love to hear from the winners in the chat. First, for our Trimate poster, the winner is Corinne Bengert. Congratulations, Corinne. Next, for the signed copy of the National Geographic, the winner is Wendy Phillips. Thank you, Wendy. Congratulations. And lastly, for the signed paperback copy of her book, Reflections of Eden, the winner is Michael Gabriel. Congratulations to each of our lucky winners, and I'll be in contact with you soon to get those prizes to your homes. Now it's time to share questions from our guests. And there are lots of questions, and we have about 20 minutes remaining. So let's try to get through as many questions as possible. And the first question is from Sue Rumbaugh. She asks, how much language did the orangutans that live near or with you come to understand?
Oh, I'm supposed to answer, sorry. I'm just trying to answer the question. It's a very interesting question. And I'll answer it. I think they understand a little bit of both Indonesian and English. But a good example actually comes from a captive orangutan. His name is Rusty, that OFI owns, who is now permanently housed at the Honolulu Zoo. And I remember once Rusty, was never taught sign language, but I was standing actually, and Rusty had a stool inside his cage, and there was a volunteer, and I was kind of burdened with stuff. And so I said to the volunteer, please get me a stool. And I didn't even really look at the stool. I just looked at her and said, please get me the stool. And the stool was close by. And suddenly Rusty got up, and he'd been sitting right in front of me. And he ran over and he got the stool that was in his enclosure and brought it in front of me. I mean, he didn't give it to me because, the bars. And I suddenly realized that Rusty had understood what I'd said, because I hadn't looked at the stool. I hadn't looked at him. I had looked at the volunteer. And I hadn't looked at the stool. It was like, please get me the stool. And that to me was indicative of how much language orangutans probably understand. They probably understand much more than we give them credit for.
Excellent question. Our next one comes from Wendy Phillips, who just won one of the prizes. She asks, why do you go to Indonesian Borneo when Malaysian Borneo is far more protective of their forests and their orangutans?
I would argue with that. I think the Malaysians are much better at public relations. What would be my guess? The Indonesians have done quite a bit, but Indonesian Borneo is a much more vast place, many more people, so the Indonesians are not doing as badly as they have in the past. Why did I go to Indonesian Borneo? Because my goal actually was to go to Malaysian Borneo, either Sabah or Sarawak. But at the time when I started trying to get a visa, trying to get permissions, the Malaysians from North Borneo basically had kicked out all foreign scientists. They'd even kicked out Peace Corps workers. And so I was told, verboten, nobody was going to go to Malaysia. So started concentrating on the Indonesians, and Louis Leakey actually knew Barbara Harrison, who had also worked with Indonesians, and through Barbara Harrison, she introduced me to one or two Indonesian officials. So in Indonesia, I actually wanted to go to Sumatra, but the head of forestry, the forestry agency of nature protection, forest protection, or whatever, said, no, he said, we just had a Dutch couple go to Sumatra, and you look like the kind of person who wants to be a pioneer. He was clever. He said, why don't you go to Central Borneo? And so, of course, he was the official, and I agreed. That's how I ended up in Kalimantan Tengah. And I'm very, very glad I did, because that's where I met my husband, and that's where I continue my work today.
Incredible. Our next question comes from a board member of the Leakey Foundation, Camilla Smith, and she asks, you observed gender role variation. Did this correlate with stress or hormone differences?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Whose stress or hormone differences?
I'm assuming they're orangutans.
No. Males or females, or could the question be detailed a little bit more so I can answer it properly?
Yeah, why don't we come back to this question? Camilla, we'll get back to that question, I promise. Our next question actually comes from a Leakey Foundation grantee, Alexandra Kralik, and she writes, I am a PhD student studying orangutan stress in flanged and unflanged males who have shown different responses to stress. I was wondering if you ever noticed fewer subadult or adult unflanged males over the years. And Alexandra is actually going to be featured on our next live episode of Lunch Break Science on November 18th. So you can learn more about her research, but she wants to hear from you.
Well, what I've noticed is that the number of adult males seems to be less than there ever used to be. And the number of subadult males seems more. But in reality, the number of males that have been coming into our study area have lessened over the years. It used to be that, an adult male would come through, and then immediately another adult male would come through, and then a third adult male would come through, and they were all coming from the same direction, which indicated to me that maybe they were related. Now, those males are gone. And one of the questions that we are asking is, where have the males gone? And the few adult males that we have been able to sample genetically are related to the females, but they don't seem to be going anyplace like they used to. But, you know, it's a question that we're asking. Where have the males gone? Especially, where have the adult males gone? Now, we know that the subadult males and the adolescent males in the study area are related to the females. They seem to be more closely related to the females. So it's a question that we have not been able to answer, but it's very clear that something is going on in Borneo that relates to the massive deforestation and the great fragmentation of the forest. And this is why long-term research, like we've been doing 50 years, we can compare the number of males, from say 30 years ago to the number of males during the last 20 years. And we find an incredible difference.
Thank you for that answer. Mark Shields in Chicago would like to know if orangutan grandmothers help in raising infants.
Well, that's a difficult question. I have seen individuals that were later, we assumed they were very closely related, two adult females, one older, one younger. And we've seen cases where they're in the same tree and the older female is playing with the infant of the younger female. And these are pairs that were later identified as mother and adult daughter. So clearly the females are not hostile to each other. They're very friendly, mother and daughter. And I've even seen a mother and daughter as adults holding hands. They didn't hold hands very long. So in terms of directly helping raise grandchildren, I think it's more indirect because they are semi-solitary in the wild, but they do meet up. And perhaps that meeting, speaking of stress, helps eliminate stress.
Mm-hmm.
If you meet up with your mother in a fir tree and you both eat together, it gives you a more peaceful view of the world, perhaps, even if you're in orangutan.
Right. I love this next question. It's actually from my colleague, Ariel Johnson, and she would like to know if there's anything you have observed an orangutan do that was truly surprising and totally unusual.
Well, we once had to capture an adult female because she had a medical problem. Mm-hmm. And in order to medicate her, we have vets, we had to take her infant away from her. So the two orangutans, mother and the infant, were put together in two transport cages while the mother was being medicated. And the adolescent daughter stayed the entire time in a tree just above these transport cages. And she came down several times and she tried to lift her younger brother out of the transport cage, but because there were bars, she couldn't pull him through. And she tried several times. And finally, but she stayed the entire time. She stayed. She might go off briefly to forage, but she stayed the entire time. It was several days that we had them in the cage while we were medicating the mother. And when we decided to release the mother, after the medication was done, we decided that we would release the infant to his older sister. And we opened the cage door, stepped aside, and the adolescent female went down like a shot. She picked up her younger brother, put him on her side, and moved into the trees and moved away. Then we released the mother. The mother was fairly angry, kiss squeaking, hooting and hollering like they sometimes do. And she went after her daughter and her son. And then a short while later, we didn't actually see the actual transfer, but our assistants were following. And next time I myself saw the mother, she was carrying her infant. And so the transfer must have occurred shortly after the mother was released from the transfer case. And somehow this surprised me because, I had been so indoctrinated before I went into the field that orangutans were solitary, they didn't have social relations, But yes, orangutans are just primates like everybody else, and they do know who their siblings are. They do know who their parents are. They might not know who their fathers are for sure, but they know that this is the male that, copulated or, consorted with their mothers. So orangutans are just as social as everybody else in terms of the higher primates, except they don't express it directly and openly like we do. And that's one of the things that I have learned over the years. And the other thing about them is that talk about tool using. And they have models. Wild-born ex-captives have learned to use our boats. One tried to, get our speedboat started, by pulling on the rope, the starter rope. They do all kinds of painted our houses. They're incredible tool users. But again, in the wild, the opportunities to do that don't seem to be so necessary.
Excellent. Well, we have about 4 minutes left, so I think we can get through 2 more questions if we're really efficient. Let's follow up with Camilla's question. Did the females who copulated with each other have different hormones from those who did not? Or was this observation of adolescent experimentation without hormonal differences?
I don't know because we don't do hormonal studies.
I see.
It's just observational. And it didn't seem that stressful, except that the younger female wasn't quite so interested. And she did protest a tiny bit, if I recall correctly, but it wasn't like adult females who protest against subadult males forcibly copulating with them. These females will engage in absolute struggles, fights with the subadult males, and sometimes they'll end up on the ground. So I don't have hormonal data because we've never done hormonal studies.
All right. Next question. Dr. Holly Dunsworth, who is a paleoanthropologist, would like to know how tasty are orangutan foods to a human palate? Now, you've documented over 300 foods that orangutans eat. Have you tried any of them?
I've tried many of them. Most ripe fruits that orangutans eat are actually quite tasty, but they have to be totally ripe. And the other thing, the exception is rangas. And rangas burns, and it must be acidic because it burns the lips of orangutans, wild orangutans who eat it. And you can see them coming through the forest. And if they have black lips, you know that they have been eating rangas. And I apologize. I know the scientific name of rangas, but I just can't recall it this very moment. It's called the senior moment.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Well, I think we have time for one last question, and I think this is a great one to end on. Sarah asks, looking back over your 50-year career, what do you feel most proud of?
What I feel most proud of is that I survived. I was able to stay 50 years in Indonesia. I was able to establish a research program that continues to this day. I was able to employ almost 250 local Indonesians, most indigenous, to work in orangutan conservation and orangutan research. We were able to return over 800 wild-born ex-captives back to the wild. We were able to establish in the last 3 years an education program that since 2018 has gone to over 200 different schools and maybe about 50 villages and spoken to about 50,000 people. We've also established a a tree planting program, a rewilding program. And this was established in mid-2017. And the pandemic kind of put a stop to it. We couldn't plant like we used to. We can't plant trees remotely from home. And many of our assistants were self-isolating. But we have planted over 400,000 trees, native trees, in areas that were burned in the huge, massive fires, forest fires of 2015 and 2019. And we're continuing, and we have the support of the local government. Now, when our educator goes out with her assistants, she brings thousands or hundreds of seedlings, and she gives every student and every villager who attends the education session one seedling, and they plant it right then and there in the local area. So I'm proud of all these achievements, and all of those have taken place in Indonesia. And of course, I'm very proud that we established the Orangutan Foundation International.
So much to be proud of, and we are so proud of you. And we thank you, all of us, for this extraordinary evening, and especially for the good works that you've been doing for the past 50 years. I'm certain that all of us will remember tonight with great happiness and also hope. Thank you.
And I also want to thank the Leakey Foundation for its support through all these years. And thank you very, very much for continuing this support, both financial, but also moral, for encouraging me to continue. I really appreciate it, in the spirit of Louis Leakey.
Well, as we talked about this afternoon, to 50 more years. So I would like to thank you, our viewers, for joining us tonight and for your generous contributions that will be shared equally between the Leakey Foundation and Orangutan Foundation International. And don't forget, if you are moved by tonight's conversation and the question and answers, you can still make a donation by using the form below. Before we say goodnight, please continue this amazing celebration by participating in additional programs that OFI and the Leakey Foundation are hosting all month long. To hear more about our guest's story, subscribe to the Leakey Foundation's podcast, Origin Stories, for a very special episode. Don't miss the next live episode of the Lunch Break Science web series on Thursday, November 18th at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, featuring orangutan researcher Alexandra Kralik. If you missed yesterday's Lunch Break Science episode featuring researcher Andrew Bernard on climate change and orangutans, don't worry. You can view that program and others by accessing a special orangutan playlist we have created on YouTube. I want to offer my colleagues Ariel Johnson and Meredith Johnson at the Leakey Foundation my most sincere thanks, because their help was instrumental in tonight's program. I also want to say thanks to Talon Blanchon and our colleagues Emily Patton and Marcus Foley at Orangutan Foundation International for partnering with us tonight to make this special program possible. I encourage all of you watching to visit their website to learn more. In addition, be sure to follow the Leakey Foundation and Orangutan Foundation International on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thank you for joining us, and good night.